The Cascade Mountains stretch for hundreds of miles along the Pacific Northwest, covered in dense forests so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground. Park rangers, hikers, and locals have long whispered about what happens in those woods after dark. There are places where compasses spin without reason, where trees grow in patterns that defy nature, and where people vanish without leaving a single trace. Tonight, you're going to hear about 11 incidents that were documented, investigated, and ultimately buried because no one could explain what actually happened. Some involved experienced outdoorsmen who knew these forests better than their own homes. I've been a park ranger at Mount Baker's Snoqualmie National Forest for 17 years, and I thought I'd seen everything these woods had to offer until that morning in late September when I found the campsite on the Pratt River Trail. The report came in around 6 a.m. from a day hiker who'd noticed a tent still set up in a designated camping area, which wouldn't be unusual, except the tent was partially collapsed and the campfire had gone cold days ago. And there was no sign of whoever had been staying there. Protocol required a welfare check, so I grabbed my radio, my pack, and headed up the trail just as the sun was starting to burn through the morning fog. The hike took me about 40 minutes, and the whole way up, I could hear everything I'd heard 1,000 times before. Stellar jays calling from the canopy, the rush of the river below the trail, my boots crunching on the mixture of dirt and pine needles, the wind moving through the Douglas firs and western hemlocks that towered above me. When I reached the campsite, I found exactly what the hiker had described. A two-person tent with one side sagging where a pole had come loose. A fire ring with gray ash that crumbled when I touched it. And a backpack sitting beside a log, completely unzipped and empty, except for some granola bar wrappers and a water bottle. I called out, identifying myself as Forest Service, asking if anyone was around, and my voice carried through the trees the way it always does in these mountains, echoing slightly before fading. That's when I noticed it, though I didn't understand what I was noticing at first. The forest had gone quiet. Not unusual quiet, not the kind of quiet that happens when a hawk flies overhead and the smaller birds shut up for a minute. This was different. I stood there beside that collapsed tent, listening, and I realized I couldn't hear anything at all. No birds, no insects, no wind, no river, even though the Pratt River was less than 100 yards downhill and had been loud enough to hear clearly just minutes ago. I held my breath and listened harder, and in that moment, I became aware of something that shouldn't be possible. I couldn't hear my own heartbeat. I could feel it, could feel the pulse in my neck and wrists, but there was no sound. I stomped my boot on the ground, hard, and watched the dirt kick up, but there was nothing. No impact sound, no crunch of debris. I pulled my radio from my belt and keyed the mic, and I felt the click of the button under my thumb, but heard absolutely nothing. No static, no squelch, nothing. That's when the fear started. That primal kind of fear that comes from somewhere deep in your brainstem. The part that kept our ancestors alive when they encountered things that didn't make sense. I backed away from the campsite slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. The silence followed me. That's the only way I can describe it. With each step I took back toward the trail, the boundary of absolute quiet moved with me, staying centered on my position. I could see a squirrel in a tree about 30 feet away, and its mouth was moving like it was chattering, but there was no sound coming from it. I started walking faster, then jogging, and I couldn't hear my own footfalls. Couldn't hear my breath, even though I was breathing hard now. Couldn't hear the branches I pushed aside or the bushes I crashed through. The silence had a weight to it. a pressure that seemed to push against my eardrums from the inside. I've read about sensory deprivation, how people who spend time in those isolation tanks sometimes start hallucinating after just an hour or two, how the human brain isn't built to handle the absence of input. I'd been in this bubble of absolute quiet for maybe 10 minutes, and I was already starting to feel disconnected from reality. Like I was watching myself move through the forest from somewhere outside my own body. I reached the main trail and turned downhill, back toward the ranger station, moving as fast as I could without completely losing control. My radio was still clipped to my belt, and I could see the little green light that indicated it was on. But I had no way of knowing if it was working, no way to call for help. After about 20 minutes of running, though time felt strange, elastic, like maybe it had been 2 minutes or 2 hours, I noticed something that made me stop dead. The trees ahead of me were moving wrong, not swaying in wind, because there was no wind, but bending slightly inward, leaning toward the trail like they were observing me. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds. But I'm telling you what I saw. The Douglas firs, some of them over 200 feet tall and hundreds of years old, were tilting just a few degrees off vertical. And as I stood there watching, frozen in place, they seemed to lean a little closer. I could see their needles trembling even though I couldn't hear anything. Couldn't hear the rustle that should have accompanied that movement. I left the trail. It was against everything I'd been trained to do, against every bit of advice I'd ever given to lost hikers, but I couldn't stay on that path with those trees closing in overhead. I headed downhill, roughly parallel to the trail but far enough off it that I was pushing through underbrush and climbing over deadfall. The silence stayed with me like a second skin. I fell twice, and both times I watched myself hit the ground, felt the impact in my bones and joints, but heard nothing. The second fall split my lip, and I could taste blood, but couldn't hear myself spit it out. I don't know how long I wandered through those woods. The sun was high overhead, then starting to sink, and I still couldn't hear anything. My throat was raw from yelling, though I couldn't even hear my own voice, couldn't tell if I was actually making any sound at all or just going through the motions. I began to wonder if the silence had somehow damaged me, if maybe I'd gone deaf and that's all this was. Just sudden, profound hearing loss that would have a perfectly reasonable medical explanation. But that didn't explain why I couldn't feel sound either. Couldn't feel the vibrations that deaf people can sometimes sense. I couldn't feel the impact of my feet on the ground in the way you normally do. Couldn't feel the ambient noise of the world as pressure and movement. It was like sound itself had stopped existing in a bubble around me. Then, just as the light was starting to fail, and I was beginning to seriously panic about spending the night in the forest in this condition, I heard something. It was so faint I thought I'd imagined it at first. The distant sound of the river. I stopped moving and concentrated, and there it was again, a whisper of running water somewhere ahead and downhill. I moved toward it, and with each step the sound grew incrementally louder. Birds began to call, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and desperate. I could hear my boots on the forest floor. The weight lifted from my eardrums, and suddenly the forest was full of normal noise again, almost overwhelming in its intensity after hours of absolute silence. I found the river and followed it downstream until I hit a Forest Service road. And from there, I made my way back to the station, just as full darkness fell. I filed a report, tried to explain what happened, and I could tell from the looks I got that nobody believed me. They searched for the missing camper, found nothing, and eventually the case was filed away as a probable voluntary disappearance. I took 2 weeks of administrative leave after that. Saw a doctor who found nothing wrong with my hearing, nothing wrong with me at all. But I know what happened in those woods. Something took the sound out of the world around me. Something that was connected to that abandoned campsite and whoever had been there before. I still work these forests because I love them, because they're my life. But I never go up the Pratt River Trail anymore. And sometimes, on very quiet mornings, when the forest goes still, I feel that pressure starting to build in my ears again, and I get the hell out as fast as I can. Because whatever followed me that day is still out there. Still hungry, still waiting in the silence between sounds. My name is Trevor, and I need to tell you what happened on Section J of the Pacific Crest Trail between Snoqualmie Pass and Stevens Pass, because my hiking partner Jessie can't tell the same story anymore. Not because she won't, but because when she talks about those 3 days in early October, she describes things I never saw and mentions events I have no memory of. And the worst part is that both of our GPS devices recorded completely different routes, even though we never separated, not even for a minute. We started the 75-mile section on a Thursday morning with perfect weather, clear skies, and that crisp autumn air that makes you grateful to be alive and moving through mountains. Jessie and I had hiked together for 6 years, completed portions of the Appalachian Trail, done multi-day trips through Olympic National Park, and we trusted each other completely. We knew our equipment, we knew our capabilities, and we'd researched this section thoroughly because it's considered one of the most beautiful stretches of the PCT in Washington. Winding through the Alpine Lakes wilderness with stunning views and well-maintained trail. The first day went exactly as planned. We covered 18 miles, set up camp near a designated spot, filtered water from a clear stream, and watched the sunset paint the surrounding peaks in shades of orange and purple. We compared our GPS tracks before bed, and they matched perfectly, showing our progress as a clean line following the trail corridor. Everything was normal. Everything made sense. The second day started to go wrong around noon, though we didn't realize it immediately. We'd stopped for lunch beside what our map indicated was a distinctive granite formation that the guidebook mentioned specifically, describing it as looking like 3 fingers pointing skyward. We took photos, ate our trail mix and energy bars, and continued north. About 2 hours later, Jessie stopped walking and turned to look at me with this confused expression. She pointed ahead and said, "Is that the finger rock again?" I looked where she was indicating, and there it was. The same 3-finger granite formation rising from the forest floor about a quarter mile ahead of us. I pulled out my GPS, and according to the device, we'd traveled 4.2 miles north from our lunch spot. The trail had been relatively straight, following a ridgeline, and we hadn't backtracked or taken any wrong turns. We'd been walking steadily uphill. But there was no denying what we were seeing. That rock formation was distinctive, unique, and we were approaching it from the same direction we had 5 hours earlier. Jessie suggested that maybe there were 2 similar formations, that granite can form in patterns, that we were being paranoid. We hiked past the rocks, and I stopped to examine them closely. There, scratched into a patch of lichen on the western face, were my initials that I'd carved during lunch. The same marks, in the same spot. We'd looped back somehow. We sat down and spread out our physical map, trying to make sense of it. The trail in this section didn't loop. It ran north-south in a relatively straight line, with some switchbacks for elevation changes, but nothing that would bring us back to the same location. I suggested we'd gotten turned around somehow, made a wrong turn without noticing. But Jessie shook her head and showed me her GPS track. According to her device, we'd been walking in a perfectly straight line north for 6.3 miles. According to my device, we'd traveled 4.2 miles north, then curved east, then south, then back west in a rough circle. We were looking at the same landmarks. We'd walked side by side the entire time, but our devices had recorded two completely different routes. We decided to mark the trail. Jessie tied a piece of bright orange flagging tape to a tree branch about 10 feet past the granite formation, something we'd definitely notice if we came back this way. Then we continued north, both of us watching our compasses carefully, both of us certain that we were maintaining a northern heading. The sun was starting to sink toward the western horizon when we saw the orange tape. It was tied to a tree branch about 50 yards ahead of us, fluttering in the breeze. We hadn't turned around. We hadn't looped back consciously. We'd been walking in what felt like a straight line for hours, and we'd somehow returned to the same spot. I felt my breathing get shallow, felt that edge of panic starting to creep in. Jessie was checking her GPS frantically, and her face had gone pale. According to her device, we'd just completed another 8 miles of northward progress. According to mine, we'd walked in an expanding spiral pattern. Neither track made any sense given that we'd ended up at the orange tape. I suggested we try something different. Forget the trail entirely and just walk due north through the forest, using our compasses and keeping the setting sun to our left. Jessie agreed, and we left the marked trail, pushing through underbrush and climbing over deadfall, maintaining a strict northern heading. We hiked until dark, maybe 2 hours of difficult off-trail travel, and we set up our tent in a small clearing. Neither of us wanted to check our GPS devices, but we eventually did. Jessie's showed us 22 miles north of where we'd started that morning. Mine showed us in a location that was physically impossible, off the edge of the map, floating in white space where no terrain existed. We didn't sleep much that night. Every sound in the forest seemed threatening, and the trees around our clearing felt too close, too attentive. In the morning, we packed up and agreed to try one more time to hike north. If we couldn't make progress by afternoon, we'd activate our emergency beacon and call for rescue, even though we had no injuries and plenty of supplies. The embarrassment of needing rescue would be better than staying trapped in whatever this was. We walked north. We walked for 6 hours straight, taking only brief stops for water, pushing ourselves hard. The terrain changed around us, shifting from dense forest to rocky outcrops to meadows and back to forest. We crossed streams and climbed ridges. We marked our route by carving symbols into trees every quarter mile. Distinctive marks we definitely recognize. And then, just after 2 in the afternoon, we saw the granite fingers again. The same formation, the same rocks. My initials were still there. Jessie's orange tape was still tied to the branch. The marks we'd carved into trees that morning surrounded us in a rough circle, as if we'd been orbiting this spot without realizing it, getting closer with each loop. Jessie started laughing, this high-pitched sound that wasn't really laughter at all. And I grabbed her shoulders and told her to breathe, to focus, to stay with me. We sat down with our backs against the finger rocks and tried to think logically. We had food for another 4 days. We had water filtration. We had shelter. We weren't in immediate danger, except that we seemed to be trapped in some kind of geographic impossibility. That's when I noticed them. There were other markers on the trees around us, not our marks. Older carvings, some of them weathered and faded, initials and dates carved into bark that had partially healed over. I stood up and walked to the nearest tree, examining the marks closely. The oldest one I could find was dated 1989. The most recent besides ours, was from 2 months ago. Just initials. KM. Jessie was looking at another tree and her voice was shaking when she called me over. The carving she'd found read, Day 6. Still can't leave. If you find this, don't try to go north. It was signed with initials, PW, and dated October 2023. We spent the next hour documenting every carving we could find. There were 11 different sets of initials spanning 36 years, all concentrated in the area around the finger rocks. Some were just names and dates. Others had brief messages. Going to try east tomorrow. Food running low. Something is keeping us here. The implications were terrifying. Either we'd stumbled into an area where multiple groups of hikers had gotten lost and carved messages before eventually finding their way out, or we were looking at evidence of people who'd never left at all. I refused to accept the second possibility. Jessie suggested we try walking in a different direction entirely. Not north toward our destination, but south, back the way we'd come, retracing our route to Snoqualmie Pass. At least we knew that direction had worked before. I agreed, and we gathered our gear and started walking south on the trail. For the first hour, everything seemed fine. The terrain was changing, the landmarks were new, and we were making progress. Then Jessie grabbed my arm and pointed. Ahead of us on the trail, tied to a tree branch, was a piece of bright orange flagging tape. We hadn't tied tape to anything south of the finger rocks. We'd only marked the trail to the north. But there it was, the same tape, the same tree, and as we got closer, I could see the granite fingers rising behind it. We'd walked south for an hour and ended up at the same spot. I activated our emergency beacon. I didn't care anymore about the embarrassment or the questions we'd have to answer. We needed help. We needed out, and I wasn't going to let pride or confusion keep us in this place any longer. The beacon showed a signal transmission, a solid green light indicating our distress call was being sent. We set up camp right there at the finger rocks and waited for rescue. Night fell, and we kept our headlamps on, not wanting to be in the dark. Jessie was quiet, and I could tell she was running through explanations in her head, trying to find the rational answer that would make sense of everything. I was doing the same thing and coming up empty. Around midnight, we heard voices. They were distant, echoing through the trees, and they sounded like they were calling someone's name. We shouted back, yelling that we were here, that we needed help, that we'd activated a distress beacon. The voices continued, but they didn't get any closer. They just kept calling the same name over and over. Camden, Camden, where are you? The calling went on for about 20 minutes, always maintaining the same distance, never approaching, never receding. Then it stopped abruptly, and the forest went silent. We didn't sleep at all that night. The rescue team found us the next morning. 3 search and rescue personnel with full gear and a tracking dog, and they looked confused about why we'd called for help when we were less than 2 miles from the trailhead at Stevens Pass. They showed us on their map. The finger rocks, according to them, were right next to the trail, an easy landmark that day hikers used all the time. We'd camped 73 miles into the section. We'd walked for 3 days. We'd looped back to the same spot multiple times. But according to the rescuers, according to their GPS and their maps, we were exactly where we'd started, having barely left the trailhead at all. They attributed our confusion to dehydration or altitude sickness, even though we'd been drinking plenty of water and the elevation wasn't extreme. They hiked us out in under an hour, and the whole time, Jessie and I were looking at each other, knowing what we'd experienced, but having no way to prove it. When we got home and downloaded our GPS data, it got even stranger. Jesse's device showed a perfect 75-mile track from Snoqualmie to Stevens Pass, completed in 3 days. No loops, no backtracking. My device showed a tight spiral pattern covering less than 2 miles of distance, circling the finger rocks. The same hike, side by side, recorded 2 completely different ways. We tried to report the carvings on the trees, the warnings, from other hikers, but when a ranger went to check, he found nothing. No initials, no dates, no messages. Just the granite formation and the forest and the trail. Jessie doesn't hike with me anymore. She says she still has nightmares about the orange tape, about walking forever and ending up exactly where you started. I look at my GPS sometimes, at that spiral pattern, and I know it wasn't dehydration or altitude or any rational explanation. Something in those woods bent space or time or both, and we were lucky to get out at all. I think about those other initials sometimes, the ones we found carved into the trees. I think about KM from 2 months ago, and PW from 2023, and all the others spanning back to 1989. I think about whether they ever made it out, or if they're still there somehow, still walking in circles around those 3 fingers of stone, still trying to find a path that leads anywhere but back to the beginning. The following account is reconstructed from archived documents obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2019. The original testimony was given by Philip Gustavo, a timber faller employed by Cascade Timber Industries, in November 1973. The company ceased operations in 1981, and all corporate records were reportedly destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1984. This transcript represents one of the few surviving documents from what company insiders referred to as the Watershed Incident. Testimony of Philip Gustavo, recorded November 8, 1973, at the offices of Cascade Timber Industries, Darrington, Washington. Present: Company Supervisor Wilson Davis, Corporate Attorney Mauricio Hassan, and CTI Safety Officer Dario Eliseo. I need to start by saying, I've been working in timber for 22 years, since I was 17 years old. I've seen every kind of forest there is in these mountains, worked every terrain from gentle slopes to places so steep you need to rope yourself to the trees just to stay upright while you're cutting. I'm telling you this so you understand, I'm not some green kid who spooks easy. What we found up in Section 47 of the Watershed Tract, that's something different entirely. That's something that doesn't belong in any forest I've ever worked. We started the Section 47 operation on October 15th. It was supposed to be a straightforward clear-cut, about 80 acres of old-growth Douglas fir and western hemlock, some of those trees easily 300 years old. Beautiful timber, straight grain, minimal rot. The kind of trees that make your whole season profitable. We had a crew of 8, myself and Sean as the fallers, Boston and Colson running the yarder, Keanu on the loader, and 3 choker setters, including a kid named Crew, who'd only been with us about 6 months. The first week went fine. We were averaging about 30 trees a day, good production numbers, and the weather was holding clear and cold. Perfect for working. The logging road CTI had bulldozed into the section was holding up well, and we were ahead of schedule. Then on October 22nd, I was marking trees about 200 yards north of where we'd been cutting, getting ready for the next day's work, when I noticed something strange about the forest ahead of me. There was a gap in the canopy. Not unusual by itself. Sometimes you get a natural clearing where a tree has fallen and opened up the overhead cover. But this looked different. Too circular. Too perfect. I walked toward it, and as I got closer, I realized I was looking at a clearing that had no business being there. The trees around it formed an almost perfect circle, And inside that circle, nothing was growing. Not saplings, not ferns, not salal, not even moss. Just bare dirt in a ring about 40 feet across. I stepped into the clearing, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it got. The wind that had been moving through the canopy just stopped. No bird sounds, no squirrels, nothing. The second thing I noticed was the stones. They were arranged in a circle about 15 feet in diameter, right in the center of the clearing. Smooth river stones, each one about the size of a bowling ball. And they'd been placed there deliberately. You could tell from the way they were spaced. Perfectly even distances between each stone, 12 of them in total. I walked over to the circle, and that's when I saw what was in the center. I'm going to describe this exactly as I saw it. And I swear to you, on everything I hold sacred, that I'm telling the truth. In the middle of that stone circle was a pile of teeth. Human teeth. Maybe 200 or 300 of them, arranged in concentric rings, spiraling inward toward the center. They were old, discolored, some of them broken, but they were definitely human molars and incisors and canines. And they were arranged in a pattern, deliberate, like someone had placed each one carefully. I didn't touch anything. I backed away and went straight to Wilson, told him what I'd found. He didn't believe me at first, thought maybe I'd seen some animal bones or something. But I convinced him to come look. We brought Sean and Boston with us, and all 4 of us stood there staring at that clearing, at those stones, at those teeth. Nobody said much. What do you say about something like that? Wilson made the call to shut down operations for the day. He used the radio to contact the office, told them we'd found something that needed to be investigated before we could continue. The next day, 3 men showed up from headquarters. I'd never seen any of them before. They spent about 4 hours in that clearing, took photographs, collected samples, and then they had a long meeting with Wilson in his truck. After they left, Wilson called us all together and told us that what we'd found was an old Native American ceremonial site, that it was probably a couple hundred years old, and that the company was handling it properly with the relevant authorities. He said we were to continue operations, but avoid that specific clearing, leave a buffer of trees around it, and not discuss what we'd found with anyone outside the crew. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. 3 days later, on October 26th, crew didn't show up for work. Nobody thought much of it at first. Young guys sometimes tie one on too hard and sleep through their alarm. But when he didn't show up the second day either, Wilson drove to his apartment in Darrington. The landlord let him in. The place was empty. Not just crew gone, but all his stuff gone too. Bed stripped, closet empty, bathroom cleared out, like he'd moved out in a hurry. The landlord said he hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen crew leave, had no idea where he'd gone. Wilson reported it to the company, and they filed a missing person report with the county sheriff. The sheriff came up to the site, asked us some questions, but there wasn't much we could tell him. Crew had seemed fine on the 25th, worked a full day, didn't mention any problems or plans to leave. He just vanished. A week after crew disappeared, Boston started acting strange. He kept talking about dreams he was having, dreams about the clearing, about walking through the forest at night and finding the stone circle. And in his dreams, there were people standing around it, but they didn't have faces. Just smooth skin where their faces should be. He told me he kept waking up around 3 in the morning, convinced he could hear people whispering outside his window. But every time he looked, there was nobody there. On November 2nd, Boston didn't come to work. His wife called Wilson, frantic, saying Boston had left the house around midnight and hadn't come back. She'd heard him get up, heard the door open and close, and when she'd looked outside, she'd seen him walking down their driveway toward the road, still in his pajamas. She'd called after him, but he didn't respond, just kept walking. She thought he was sleepwalking, but when he didn't come back after an hour, she'd driven around looking for him. She never found him. The sheriff's department organized a search. They brought in dogs, had volunteers combing the area around Boston's house, checked the highways and back roads. Nothing. Boston had walked out of his house in the middle of the night and disappeared as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. That's when Wilson shut down the entire Section 47 operation. He told the company what was happening, and for once, they listened. CTI pulled us out of that watershed tract and sent us to work on a different parcel about 20 miles away. But we all knew something was wrong. Something connected to that clearing and those stones and those teeth. The third disappearance happened on November 5th. Keanu. He'd been talking to his girlfriend on the phone, a normal conversation, making plans for the weekend. And then he'd suddenly gone quiet. She'd asked if he was still there, and he'd said something she couldn't quite make out, something that sounded like, "They're calling me." Then he'd hung up. She'd driven to his place immediately, but he was gone. His truck was still in the driveway, his wallet and keys were still on the kitchen counter, but Keanu was nowhere to be found. 3 men missing in 2 weeks, all from the same logging crew, all after we'd found that clearing. The sheriff was asking questions nobody could answer. CTI brought in their lawyers, started talking about liability and worker safety. And then, on November 7th, the company made us all sign non-disclosure agreements. They said it was standard procedure, protecting trade secrets and operational details. But we all knew what it was really about. They wanted us quiet about the clearing, about what we'd found, about the disappearances. I'm violating that NDA by giving this testimony. But I don't care anymore. 3 men are gone, and nobody seems interested in finding them. The sheriff's department closed the cases as voluntary disappearances, classified crew in Boston and Keanu as adults who chose to walk away from their lives. But I was there. I saw how scared Boston was in those last days before he vanished. I heard Keanu's girlfriend describe that phone call, the tone in his voice when he said someone was calling him. The company buried the whole thing. They finished the Section 47 clear-cut the following spring with an entirely different crew. And according to the production reports I've seen, they removed every tree from that tract, including the ones around the clearing. There's no mention in any official document of what we found, no photographs in the company archives, no record that we ever stopped operations or called for an investigation. It's like those 3 days in October never happened. But I know they did. I know what I saw. And I know that somewhere in the Cascade watershed, there's a logging road that leads to a clear cut where nothing grows anymore, where the center of what used to be a circular clearing in old-growth forest is now just scarred earth and scattered stones. I've thought about going back, about trying to find the exact location, but the truth is, I'm too afraid. Because I think whatever was in that clearing, whatever those stones and those teeth represented, it's still there. It survived the logging. It survived the bulldozers and the yarders and the trucks that hauled away every piece of timber. And I think it's still calling to people, still reaching out from whatever time or place it came from. Sometimes I wake up at night, around 3 in the morning, and I swear I can hear whispering. I tell myself it's the wind, it's the house settling, it's my imagination. But deep down, I know what it really is. It's the same thing Boston heard. It's the same thing that made Keanu say, "They're calling me," on the phone. It's the forest calling us back to finish what we started. End of testimony. Note: Philip Gustavo left Cascade Timber Industries in December 1973. He moved to Oregon and worked in construction until his retirement in 1995. Attempts to contact him for follow-up interviews in 2019 were unsuccessful. According to public records, he died in March 2018. The current location of Section 47 in the watershed tract could not be determined from available CTI documents. The disappearances of Crew Coulson, Boston Wilson, and Keanu Davis remain unsolved. No human remains matching their descriptions have ever been found. My name is Mailani, and I've been a nature photographer for 12 years, specializing in time-lapse work that captures the slow movements most people never notice. The way frost forms on leaves over the course of an hour. The pattern clouds make as they roll across mountain peaks. The subtle shift of shadows as the sun tracks across the sky. I make my living selling these sequences to documentary producers and nature magazines. And I've spent countless nights alone in the wilderness with my camera equipment, waiting for something beautiful to happen. In early September, I set up camp at Lake Wenatchee State Park for what I planned to be a 2-week shoot focusing on old-growth Douglas firs. The park sits in a valley surrounded by the Cascade Mountains, and the south campground backs up against a stretch of forest that contains some truly massive trees, several of them easily 300 years old. My goal was to capture the transition from late summer to early fall, to document the way light changes as the season shifts and the way the forest responds to shorter days and cooler nights. I pitched my tent in Site 47, which was partially isolated from the main camping loop, tucked back against the tree line. About 30 feet from my tent stood one of the largest Douglas firs I'd ever seen, easily 12 feet in diameter at the base, with bark so thick and deeply fissured it looked almost like sculptured stone. The tree towered above the canopy, and I estimated its height at close to 250 feet. It was perfect for what I had in mind. I set up my primary camera on a tripod positioned to capture the full height of the tree, framing it against the sky with enough surrounding forest to provide context. I programmed the camera to take one exposure every 30 seconds, which over the course of 8 hours would give me just under 1,000 frames that I could compress into about 30 seconds of smooth video. The interval was long enough to capture subtle changes in light and shadow, but short enough to create fluid motion when played back. The first night's footage was beautiful in exactly the way I'd hoped. The playback showed the sun setting behind the mountains, shadows lengthening across the forest floor, the sky shifting from blue to orange to purple to black. Stars emerged overhead, and the tree stood like a sentinel, unchanging and solid, while everything around it flowed and transformed. I was pleased with the composition and decided to run the same setup for several more nights, building a library of footage I could edit together later. The second night, I fell asleep in my tent around 10 and woke up around 3 in the morning needing to use the restroom. I stumbled out of my tent with my headlamp and happened to glance at the tree as I walked past it. Something looked different, though I couldn't immediately identify what. The bark seemed somehow softer in the beam of my light, less rigid. I stood there for a moment, still half asleep, and I could have sworn I saw the trunk expand slightly, like a chest filling with air, then contract. I blinked, adjusted my headlamp, and looked again. The tree was perfectly still. I attributed the movement to tiredness and continued to the restroom. When I reviewed the second night's footage the next morning, I noticed something I'd missed in the first night's sequence. If I watched carefully, frame by frame, the tree's trunk appeared to be moving, not swaying in wind, but expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic pattern. The change was subtle, maybe an inch or two of diameter shift, but it was consistent throughout the 8-hour recording. The expansion would happen over the course of about 15 minutes. Then the contraction would take another 15 minutes, creating a cycle that repeated roughly every half hour. I checked my equipment, thinking maybe I'd bumped the tripod or the lens had some kind of focusing issue that was creating an illusion of movement. Everything was solid and properly secured. I reviewed the first night's footage more carefully, and there it was. The same rhythmic expansion and contraction, present throughout the entire sequence. I'd just been too focused on the lighting and color to notice it before. As a photographer, I'm trained to observe, to see patterns and details that most people miss. And what I was seeing in this footage was impossible. Trees don't breathe. They don't have lungs or muscles. They don't expand and contract rhythmically like living creatures with respiratory systems. But the evidence was right there in the time-lapse, undeniable and repeating with mechanical precision. I spent the third day examining the tree in person. I walked around its entire circumference, studying the bark, pressing my hands against it, looking for any explanation for what my camera had captured. The bark was thick and deeply furrowed, exactly as you'd expect on an ancient Douglas fir. It was cool to the touch, slightly damp from morning dew. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing that suggested anything other than a normal, albeit very large tree. That night, I set up 3 cameras instead of 1. I positioned them at different angles around the tree, each programmed to capture the same 30-second intervals. I wanted to see if the movement was visible from multiple perspectives, wanted to rule out any possibility that it was an artifact of the single camera position. I also decided to stay awake and watch the tree myself. I set up a camp chair about 20 feet away, made a thermos of coffee, and committed to observing it directly for several hours. If the tree was really moving, I wanted to see it with my own eyes, not just through a camera lens. For the first hour, nothing happened. The tree stood motionless, a massive dark shape against the slightly lighter darkness of the night sky. The forest around me was full of normal sounds. Wind in the canopy, an owl calling from somewhere deeper in the woods, the distant rush of the Wenatchee River. Then, around 11:30, I noticed it. The trunk was moving. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious if you weren't specifically watching for it, but definitely moving. It was expanding, the bark plates shifting slightly outward, and I could hear a faint creaking sound, like wood under pressure. The expansion lasted about 15 minutes, then stopped. The tree held that increased diameter for a moment, then began to contract, the bark plates settling back into their original position. I stood up and walked closer, keeping my eyes fixed on the trunk. As I got within a few feet, I realized I could feel it. Not just see it, but actually feel the movement through the air. A subtle pressure wave that pulsed outward with each expansion. It reminded me of standing near a large speaker and feeling the bass vibrations in your chest. The tree was generating some kind of rhythmic force, pushing outward and pulling inward in a cycle that resembled breathing so closely it was disturbing. I placed my hand flat against the bark during the next expansion cycle, and I felt it push against my palm. The sensation was warm, warmer than the bark had any right to be in the cool night air. And there was something about the texture that made my skin crawl. It wasn't like touching wood anymore. It felt slightly yielding, almost organic in a way that wood should never feel. I pulled my hand back and returned to my chair, suddenly not wanting to be quite so close to the tree. I watched it go through 3 more cycles, and with each one, I became more convinced that what I was witnessing wasn't just unusual, it was fundamentally wrong. This wasn't a tree, or it wasn't just a tree. It was something else. Something that had grown into the shape of a Douglas fir, but functioned according to different rules. Around 1 in the morning, I noticed something new. There was a split in the bark about 6 feet up from the ground, a vertical fissure that I'd seen during my examination earlier in the day. As I watched, that fissure widened slightly during an expansion cycle, and I caught a glimpse of what was inside. The interior of the tree should have been wood, solid heartwood surrounded by layers of growth rings. Instead, I saw something dark and glistening, something that moved independently of the trunk's expansion, something that looked disturbingly like tissue. I grabbed my high-powered flashlight and aimed it at the fissure during the next expansion. The crack widened enough for me to see inside, and what I saw made me physically recoil. The hollow interior was lined with something organic, something that resembled muscle or membrane, reddish-brown and slick with moisture. And it was moving, contracting and relaxing in rhythm with the tree's breathing, pulsing with what looked like veins or vessels running through it. I thought about the time-lapse footage, about how my tent was positioned less than 30 feet from this thing, about how I'd been sleeping here for 3 nights while this ancient whatever it was had been breathing and pulsing and doing God knows what just outside my tent. My first instinct was to pack up immediately and leave. But the photographer in me, the part of me that documents instead of running, needed to understand what I was seeing. I downloaded the footage from all 3 cameras and watched it on my laptop. Every angle showed the same thing: rhythmic expansion and contraction, the tree breathing with the regularity of a metronome. But there was something else I noticed when I synchronized the 3 videos and watched them side by side. The roots were moving too. I could see them just barely breaking the surface of the soil around the tree's base, and they were shifting position with each breath cycle. Subtle but definite movement, like fingers stretching and contracting. I made a decision that I knew was stupid, even as I was doing it. I needed to see more of the interior. I needed to understand what this thing was. I took my largest knife and approached the tree, waiting for it to enter an expansion phase. When the fissure widened, I wedged the knife into the crack and pried, trying to widen the opening just enough to get a better view inside. The tree responded. I don't know how else to describe it. The moment my knife blade penetrated past the bark layer, the expansion stopped mid-cycle, and the tree contracted violently, crushing the blade and trapping it in the bark. I let go of the handle and stepped back, and I swear to you the tree made a sound. Not the creaking of wood under stress, but a low vocalization, like a groan or exhalation that came from somewhere deep inside its trunk. I ran back to my campsite and started packing. I didn't care about the camera still recording, didn't care about the rest of my planned shoot. I needed to be away from that tree, needed to be out of the forest entirely. As I was shoving my sleeping bag into its compression sack, I happened to look up at the tree one more time. The bark was different. Where before it had been vertical plates of weathered brown and gray, now I could see patterns. They looked like faces, dozens of them, barely visible in the texture of the bark, but unmistakable once I'd noticed them. Human faces, mouths open, eyes wide, pressed against the inner surface of the bark like they were trying to push through from inside. I left Lake Wenatchee at 4 in the morning, abandoning 3 expensive cameras and most of my camping gear. I drove straight home to Seattle and didn't stop shaking until the sun came up, when I finally worked up the courage to review the footage from that final night. I found 8 hours of recording showing the tree's breathing pattern, and in the last 15 minutes, you can see me approaching with a knife, see the tree's violent contraction, and if you turn the volume up all the way, you can hear that sound, that impossible groan that shouldn't come from wood. But the worst part is the very last frame from the camera positioned behind my tent. You can see the edge of the tent in the foreground, and beyond it, the tree. And if you zoom in on the roots, you can see they've shifted position significantly. They're no longer oriented randomly around the tree's base. They're all pointing toward my tent, every single root stretched out in my direction, like they'd been reaching for me while I slept. I submitted a report to the Washington State Parks Department, tried to explain what I'd documented, but I don't think they believed me. They sent a ranger to check Site 47, and according to his report, there's nothing unusual about the tree. It's just a normal, very large Douglas fir, showing typical characteristics of old growth. The cameras I abandoned were gone by the time he got there. My knife was gone. Even the depression in the ground where my tent had been seemed to have vanished, filled in and covered with needles, as if I'd never been there at all. I still have the footage. Sometimes I watch it late at night, counting the breaths, trying to understand what I'd been sleeping next to for 3 nights. And I wonder how many other trees in those ancient forests are doing the same thing, expanding and contracting in the darkness, breathing while we sleep beneath them, reaching with their roots while we dream. The following is a compiled transcript of radio communications between North Cascades Search and Rescue Team Delta and base camp operations during a mission conducted on March the 14th and 15th, 2021. The mission was initiated following reports of 3 missing hikers last seen on the Cascade Pass Trail. Team Delta consisted of 5 members. Team Leader Adelie Brinley, Medical Specialist Keela Morrison, Navigation Officer Alexa Torres, Safety Officer Baylor Chen, and Communications Specialist Danny Milo. All transmissions were recorded as standard protocol. This transcript has been reviewed by multiple SAR coordinators, and no satisfactory explanation has been provided for the anomalies documented herein. March 14, 2021, 14:47 hours. Team Delta departed base camp at the Cascade Pass trailhead with full winter gear and supplies for a 48-hour search operation. Weather conditions were reported as clear with temperatures around 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The missing hikers were identified as experienced winter backpackers who had failed to return from a planned 3-day trip. Their vehicle remained at the trailhead, and no emergency beacon activation had been detected. First radio check occurred at 15:15 hours, approximately 4 miles into the search area. Team Leader Brinley reported normal conditions and confirmed all 5 team members were maintaining good pace and health. Base camp acknowledged and logged the transmission. Standard procedure called for radio checks every 30 minutes during active search operations. The 15:45 check came through clearly. Brinley reported the team had discovered fresh boot prints in a snow patch that matched the description of gear worn by the missing hikers. The prints headed northeast, off the established trail, into more difficult terrain. Team Delta requested permission to pursue the tracks, which was granted by base camp. All 5 team members confirmed ready status for off-trail navigation. Torres reported GPS coordinates and estimated they would reach the location where the tracks led within 90 minutes. At 16:15, the radio check included the first anomaly, though it was not immediately recognized as such. Brinley began her report in standard format, identifying herself and requesting confirmation from each team member. 5 voices responded with confirmation: Keela, Alexa, Baylor, Danny, and then a 6th voice that identified itself as Soul. Base camp operator Chris noted the extra response, but attributed it to possible radio cross-traffic from another team. He asked Brinley to confirm team count. There was a pause of approximately 8 seconds. Then Brindley responded that all team members were present and accounted for. Count of 5. She made no mention of the 6th voice. Base camp logged the incident as probable radio interference. The 16:45 check proceeded normally. Brindley reported the team was making good progress following the boot prints, which remained clear and fresh despite the time elapsed since the hikers went missing. The tracks showed no signs of distress, maintained steady pace, and indicated the missing hikers were heading deeper into the wilderness rather than attempting to return to the trailhead. Weather remained clear, all equipment functional. 5 team members confirmed ready status. At 17:15, as daylight began to fade, Team Delta reported they had reached a small clearing where the boot prints they were following converged with another set of tracks. Torres identified these new prints as coming from standard SR boots, possibly from a previous search effort, though base camp had no record of any prior teams in this specific area. Brindley made the decision to continue tracking the original missing hiker prints rather than following the SAR boot tracks. When she conducted team confirmation, 6 voices responded: Keela, Alexa, Baylor, Danny, Saul, and a new voice identifying as Treasure. Base camp operator immediately requested clarification on team composition. Brindley responded, and her voice carried clear confusion when she stated that she had 5 team members with her. But she couldn't explain the extra voices on the radio. She asked each person physically present to sound off by tapping their radio twice instead of speaking. Base camp recorded 5 distinct double-tap signals, confirming 5 physical team members. The source of the 2 extra voices remained unexplained. The 17:45 check showed increased concern from Team Delta. Brindley reported they had found a backpack belonging to one of the missing hikers, abandoned beside a fallen log. The pack contained food, water, and emergency supplies, all untouched. There was no apparent reason for the hiker to have left it behind. More disturbing, the boot prints continued past the abandoned pack. But now there were additional sets of prints. Torres counted 7 distinct track patterns, all heading in the same direction, when there should have been only 3 from the missing hikers. When Brindley called for team confirmation, 7 voices responded, adding names Promise and Zyla to the roll call. Brindley's voice shook when she stated that she could see only 5 team members. She could count them physically. But she was hearing 7 distinct voices on her radio. And each voice was responding with correct SAR protocol and using proper identification procedures. Base camp supervisor Hassan took over communications at 18:01. He ordered Team Delta to halt forward progress and establish a defensive perimeter. He instructed Brindley to conduct a physical visual check of each team member and confirm their identity using personal details that would not be known to outsiders. Brindley complied. She confirmed Keela Morrison, age 34, 6 years SR experience, medical specialist certification from Harborview. She confirmed Alexa Torres, age 29, 8 years SR experience, advanced navigation training, distinctive scar on left hand from climbing accident. She confirmed Baylor Chen, age 37, 10 years SAR experience, safety officer, married with 2 children. She confirmed Danny Milo, age 26, 3 years SAR experience, communication specialist, former military radio operator. All 4 team members checked out against base camp records. All 4 were physically present and accounted for. When Hassan asked Brindley to confirm the 5th team member's identity, there was a long silence. Then Brindley stated she was the 5th member. She was team leader. There had only ever been 5 people on this mission. But when Hassan asked who Soul was, who Treasure was, who Promise and Zyla were, Brindley couldn't answer. She said the names sounded familiar, like she should know them, but she couldn't place them. The 1830 check revealed 9 voices. Each voice followed correct radio protocol. Each voice identified itself properly. Each voice responded to commands and questions appropriately. But Brinley maintained that she could only see 5 people, could only count 5 headlamps in the gathering darkness, could only account for 5 physical team members standing in that clearing in the North Cascades wilderness. Hassan ordered an immediate abort of the search mission. He instructed Team Delta to mark their current location, activate emergency strobes, and begin immediate return to base camp using GPS coordinates. He stated that extraction helicopters were being contacted and would attempt pickup at first light if Team Delta could reach a suitable landing zone. At 19 Ihualai, 11 voices responded to the radio check. The new additions identified as Kylie and Marjorie. Brinley's composure was deteriorating. She reported that her 4 team members were showing signs of distress. Keela was experiencing auditory hallucinations, claiming she could hear people walking around their perimeter, but couldn't see anyone. Alexa's GPS was malfunctioning, showing their position as moving even when they were stationary. Baylor was convinced they were being followed, kept spinning around to check behind them. Danny's radio equipment was behaving erratically, picking up transmissions on frequencies that should have been empty. When Hassan asked about the boot prints they had been following, Brinley stated they had disappeared. Not gradually, not fading into harder ground, but just ended abruptly, as if the people making them had simply ceased to exist mid-step. Where the prints ended, there was a circle of stones arranged in the snow, each stone equidistant from the next, forming a perfect geometric pattern. Brinley said she didn't remember seeing the stones earlier, but they must have been there because they were partially covered with snow that would have taken hours to accumulate. The 1930 check recorded 13 voices, each voice calm, each voice professional, each voice following protocol precisely. Hassan could hear the mounting panic in Brinley's breathing, even as she tried to maintain composure. She stated they were moving, following their GPS back toward base camp, but the terrain didn't match their outbound route. Trees were in different positions. The slope angles were wrong. Alexa's compass was spinning without settling on any direction. At 20 Yank, Team Delta reported they could see lights ahead of them. Multiple lights, headlamps, or flashlights, moving through the forest in their direction. Brinley called out, identifying herself as SR team leader, requesting identification from the approaching lights. The lights stopped moving but did not respond. When Brinley conducted radio check, 15 voices responded. The new additions were Soleil and Zarya. Hassan counted the voices himself, recorded them, played them back. 15 distinct voices, each using correct SR terminology, each responding to their name, each claiming to be part of Team Delta. Hassan asked Brinley a direct question. "Can you count the lights you're seeing?" There was a long pause, then Brinley answered, "I count 15 headlamps." Hassan asked if she could see the people wearing those headlamps. Another pause. Brinley's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I can see 15 people standing in a circle around us, but I only recognize 4 of them. The other 11 are wearing SAR gear. They have radios. They have the right equipment. They're just standing there, not moving, just watching us." The 2030 check showed 17 voices on the radio. Brinley was no longer trying to maintain professional composure. She reported that the extra people, the ones she didn't recognize, were moving closer. They were tightening the circle. They weren't responding to verbal commands. When she asked them to identify themselves, they would only key their radios and say their names. Cielo, Braylon. When she demanded they explain their presence, they would repeat, "We are Team Delta. We are conducting search and rescue operations. We are here to help." At 20:47, the final transmission from Team Delta came through. It lasted approximately 43 seconds. In the recording, you can hear Brinley's voice, strained and terrified, stating, "Base camp, we are surrounded. There are at least 20 people here now. They all look like us. They're all wearing our gear. They're all—" Her voice cut off. There was a sound that multiple audio analysts have examined, a kind of low-frequency hum or vibration. Then clearly you can hear voices. 19 distinct voices, all speaking in unison, all reciting the same words. Team Delta, checking in. All members present and accounted for. Search operation continuing. Estimate missing hikers located within the hour. The transmission ended at 20:48. Base camp attempted to re-establish contact immediately and continuously throughout the night. No response was received. At first light, 2 helicopters and 3 additional ground teams were deployed to the last known coordinates of Team Delta. They found nothing. No equipment, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been in that location recently. The stone circle Brinley described was not located. The missing hikers were never found. All 5 members of Team Delta remain listed as missing. Adelie Brinley, Keela Morrison, Alexa Torres, Baylor Chen, and Danny Milo have not been seen or heard from since that final transmission. The radio recording remains in North Cascades Search and Rescue Archives. Sometimes, late at night, when conditions are right and the frequencies are clear, base camp operators report picking up brief transmissions. Always the same message. Always 19 voices speaking in perfect unison. Team Delta, checking in. All members present and accounted for. Search operation continuing. I'm writing this down because I need to remember what day it is. I need to keep track of time. My name is Jalea Maisie. I'm 28 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon. And I got lost in the Cascade Wilderness 3 days ago. I'm currently staying in a cabin I found, and something about this place isn't right. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. October 10th. I left the Glacier Peak Wilderness Trailhead around 9 in the morning for what was supposed to be a simple day hike. I've done this route before, or at least I thought I had. The trail markers seemed familiar at first, but around noon I realized I hadn't seen any other hikers, which was unusual for a Saturday. I checked my GPS and found it wasn't picking up any satellite signal. My phone had no service, which wasn't surprising this deep in the mountains. But the GPS failure was concerning. I decided to backtrack, but after an hour of walking I didn't recognize any landmarks. The trail itself seemed to be narrowing, becoming less maintained. I should have turned around then, should have activated my emergency beacon. But the weather was clear, and I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. That was my first mistake. By 4 in the afternoon, it started to rain. Not the gentle Pacific Northwest drizzle I was used to, but a heavy downpour that soaked through my jacket within minutes. The temperature dropped fast, and I knew I needed shelter. That's when I saw the cabin through the trees. It was a small structure, maybe 15 by 20 feet, built from weathered logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Smoke was rising from the chimney, which meant someone was inside. Someone who might be able to help me get back to the trailhead. I called out as I approached, identifying myself as a lost hiker, asking if anyone was home. No one answered. I knocked on the door. Silence. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, the door was unlocked. The interior was warm, lit by both a fireplace and several oil lamps. There was a neatly made bed in one corner, a small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves stocked with canned goods and supplies. Fresh firewood was stacked beside the fireplace, and a kettle on the stove was still warm to the touch. Someone had been here recently, very recently, but there was no sign of them now. I called out again, waited, got no response. I was shivering badly by then, my clothes soaked through, and the thought of going back out into that rain was unbearable. I decided to wait inside until whoever owned the cabin returned, or until morning when I could get my bearings and find my way back to the trail. I changed into some dry clothes I found in a chest by the bed. They fit perfectly, which seemed lucky at the time, and made myself some tea from supplies in the kitchen. That's when I found the journal. It was sitting on the table, a leather-bound book with no title or markings on the cover. I opened it thinking it might have contact information for the cabin's owner, and instead found page after page of handwritten entries. The first one was dated September 3rd, 1984. Found this cabin after getting separated from my hiking group. Rain came down hard and I was getting hypothermic. The door was unlocked, fire was going, food on the shelves. Can't believe my luck. We'll wait here for the storm to pass and head out tomorrow. Pearl. The entries continued. Different handwriting for each one, spanning years. Different names, different dates, but all telling essentially the same story. Someone gets lost. Someone finds the cabin. Someone decides to stay one more night. October 11th. I woke up this morning intending to leave immediately, but when I opened the cabin door, I found the rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it was worse. The forest was completely obscured by fog, visibility maybe 10 feet. I tried to use my compass to at least determine direction, but the needle was spinning slowly, unable to settle on any bearing. I checked my emergency beacon, the one I should have activated yesterday, and found the battery completely dead, even though it had been fully charged when I started my hike. So I closed the door and decided to wait. The cabin has plenty of food, plenty of firewood. One more day won't matter. I spent the morning reading more of the journal entries. There are hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Some are short, just a name and date. Others are longer, describing the hikers' plans to leave, their gratitude for finding shelter, their confusion about not being able to find the trail back. What bothers me is the dates. The entries span from 1984 to just 2 months ago. 40 years of lost hikers, all finding the same cabin, all staying for at least one night. But here's the thing that made my hands start shaking as I read. Some entries are repeated. The same handwriting, the same name, multiple times across different years. I'm staying one more night. The rain still hasn't let up. Adelaide, June 15th, 1989. Still raining. I'll try again tomorrow. I'm staying one more night. Adelaide, June 22nd, 1989. Can't find the trail. Compass isn't working. I'm staying one more night. Adelaide, July 4th, 1989. The Adelaide entries continue through August 1989, then stop. I found similar patterns for other names. Brinley has entries from 2003 to 2004, appearing every few weeks. Keela's entries span 2011, occurring sometimes just days apart. Each person starts confident they'll leave soon, and each gradually sounds more uncertain, more resigned. And they all end their entries the same way. I'm staying one more night. The last entry in the journal was dated August 15th, 2024, just 2 months ago. The handwriting was neat and precise. I know what this place is now. I know what it does. But I'm tired, and the cabin is warm, and outside there's nothing but rain and fog and trees that all look the same. I'm staying one more night. Analia. I looked at that entry for a long time. Then I picked up the pen that was lying next to the journal. It still had ink. After all these years, somehow it still had ink. And I wrote my own entry, Just my name and the date. Nothing else. I don't know why I did it. It felt important somehow, like I needed to add my name to the record. October 12th. The rain continues. I tried to leave this morning, got about 50 yards from the cabin before the fog became so thick I couldn't see the ground in front of me. I could still see the cabin, though, its lights warm and inviting through the mist. I could have kept walking, should have kept walking. But what if I got more lost? What if I fell, broke something, died of exposure out there? At least in the cabin I'm safe. I'm warm. I have food and water and shelter. I'll try again tomorrow. I'm staying one more night. I've been reading more entries. I found one from someone named Naomi dated March 1997, and her entries are the longest, the most detailed. She was a forest ranger, trained in wilderness survival, and she wrote extensively about her attempts to leave. She tried every direction, marked her path with strips of cloth, counted her steps, did everything right according to her training. Every attempt ended the same way. Back at the cabin, sometimes after hours of walking, sometimes after just minutes. She wrote about hearing voices in the fog, seeing shapes moving between the trees, feeling like the forest was watching her. Her last entry was dated June 1997, 3 months after she arrived. I understand now. The cabin keeps what it finds. We're not prisoners. We're guests. And guests eventually become part of the house. I'm staying one more night. October 13th. I didn't try to leave today. I told myself it was because the weather was too bad, because my boots were still wet, because I wanted to conserve my energy. But the truth is, I'm scared. Not of the cabin. The cabin is safe and warm and comfortable. I'm scared of what's outside. I'm scared of the fog and the rain and the forest that seems to shift and change every time I look at it. The food here never runs out. I've eaten multiple meals from the pantry, and when I checked this morning, the shelves were fully stocked again. The firewood replenishes itself too. I used half the stack yesterday, and today it's complete again, neatly piled as if I'd never touched it. The oil lamps never run dry. The water from the pump is always fresh and cold. This cabin takes care of its guests. I added another entry to the journal today. The cabin provides everything I need. Maybe it's better to wait until spring when the weather improves. I'm staying one more night. Jalea, October 14th. I found something today that I wish I hadn't. Behind the cabin, partially hidden by underbrush, there's a small area that looks like a garden or a memorial. Stones arranged in circles, about 24 of them, each with a name carved into the surface. Pearl, Adelie, Brinley, Keela, Analea, Naomi. All the names from the journal, all here, marked with stones in the ground. I should run. I should grab my pack and run blindly into the forest and not stop until I find civilization or die trying. But it's getting dark now, and the temperature is dropping, and the cabin lights are so warm. Tomorrow. I'll leave tomorrow. I have to leave tomorrow. But tonight, I'm staying one more night. October 15th. I'm still here. I went outside this morning and stood at the edge of the clearing, pack on my back, ready to go. I stood there for 20 minutes, looking into the fog. Then I turned around and went back inside. It's warm here. It's safe. Why would I leave safety to stumble through endless forest that might kill me? The cabin has never hurt me. The cabin has only helped. I wrote in the journal, I'm staying one more night. Jalea. Tomorrow I'll try again, or maybe the day after. There's no rush, really. I have everything I need right here. October 16th. I'm staying one more night. October 18th. I'm staying one more night. October 21st, I'm staying one more night. October 28th, I'm staying one more night. If you're reading this, if you found this cabin because you got lost in the fog and rain, I'm sorry. The door will be unlocked. The fire will be warm. The food will be fresh. You'll think you're lucky. You'll think you're safe. You'll tell yourself it's just for one night. But one night becomes 2, becomes 5, becomes forever. And eventually, you'll stop trying to leave. You'll stop wanting to leave. You'll become part of the cabin, another name in the journal, another stone in the ground out back. I can hear footsteps on the porch. Someone new has arrived. Someone lost. Someone cold and scared and desperate for shelter. I should warn them. I should tell them to run. But I won't, because I'm staying one more night. And so will they. The cabin always needs guests. The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife received 3 separate incident reports in November 2022 regarding unusual elk behavior in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. The reports came from experienced bow hunters who had no prior connection to each other and were hunting in areas separated by several miles. What follows are compiled excerpts from their official statements, along with analysis of trail camera footage that was submitted as evidence. All 3 hunters have since refused to return to the Gifford-Pinchot area. Statement from Vicente Jacari, November 6, 2022. Vicente is a licensed bow hunter with 19 years of experience, specializing in Roosevelt elk. He was hunting alone in a designated area approximately 8 miles south of Mount Adams when the incident occurred. I've been tracking Roosevelt elk in these mountains since I was 20 years old, and I know their behavior better than I know most people. They're creatures of habit, they move in predictable patterns, and they react to threats in consistent ways. What I saw on November 4th wasn't consistent with anything I've experienced before. And I'm not sure I can adequately explain what was wrong about it, but I'll try. I'd been following a bull for 3 days, a massive animal, probably 600 pounds, with a rack that would score well over 300. I'd set up my tree stand about 15 feet up in a Douglas fir overlooking a game trail that showed fresh sign. Around 7 in the morning, the bull appeared, moving through the underbrush about 40 yards from my position. Perfect shot opportunity, good angle, wind in my favor. I drew my bow and was about to release when the elk stopped walking and stood completely still. That's not unusual. Elk freeze when they sense something. It's a natural response. But this animal turned its head and looked directly at my tree stand. Not in the general direction, but precisely at the spot where I was positioned. And it held that gaze for what felt like a full minute. Then it did something I've never seen an elk do in my entire life. It stood up on its hind legs, not rearing up like they do when they're fighting or playing. This animal shifted its weight back, planted its rear hooves, and straightened up until it was standing vertically, almost like a person. It stayed like that for maybe 10 seconds, looking at me with its front legs hanging down at its sides, then dropped back to all fours and walked away. Not ran, walked. Slowly and deliberately, like it was making a point. I didn't take the shot. I couldn't. Something about the way it moved, the way it looked at me, made me feel like I wasn't the hunter anymore. I packed up my gear and left the area that same day. Statement from Jacai Truitt, November 9th, 2022. Jacai has 12 years of hunting experience and was part of a 2-person team hunting in the Indian Heaven Wilderness area of Gifford-Pinchot. His partner, Sam Wilson, corroborates his account. Sam and I had been out for 4 days, tracking a small herd of cows and 1 bull. Good hunting area, we'd taken elk there before, know the terrain well. On November 7th, we split up to cover more ground, stayed in radio contact, Standard procedure. I was working a ridgeline when I spotted the bull about 60 yards downslope, moving through a stand of hemlocks. I got into position for a shot, and that's when I noticed something off about its gait. Elk move a certain way. There's a rhythm to how they walk, how they place their hooves. This one was moving wrong. Too deliberate, too measured. I watched it through my rangefinder for a few minutes, trying to figure out what I was seeing. And then I realized it was walking around obstacles instead of through them. Let me explain. When elk move through brush, they push through it. They're big animals. They're not bothered by branches or undergrowth. But this bull was navigating around obstacles, choosing paths that avoided dense brush, stepping over fallen logs instead of jumping them or going around. It was moving like something that was thinking about efficiency, about conserving energy, about choosing the best route. It was problem-solving. I radioed Sam, told him what I was seeing, and he moved to a position where he could observe the same animal. We both watched it for about 20 minutes. And during that time, it did something that made us both decide to pack out immediately. The bull walked up to one of our tree stands, the one Sam had been using the day before, and it looked up at it. Then it reached up with one front hoof and pulled on the lowest support strap, testing it. When the strap held, it moved to the tree next to it and looked up into the branches, like it was assessing whether it could climb. We left our stands in the forest. We weren't going back for them. Trail camera footage submitted by Hassan Davis, November 12, 2022. Hassan is a wildlife photographer and hunter who maintains several trail cameras in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest for research purposes. The camera in question was positioned along a game trail in the Dark Divide area, programmed to activate on motion and capture both photos and 30-second video clips. The footage spans 6 nights, from November 1st through November 6th. During the first 3 nights, the camera captured typical elk behavior. Animals moving along the trail, stopping to browse, interacting with each other in normal patterns. The elk appearing in these early clips show standard movement and behavior. On November 4th, the footage changes. At 2:47 a.m., a large bull elk appears on the trail, moving from south to north. It stops directly in front of the camera and appears to examine it. The animal's head tilts at an angle that suggests curiosity rather than alarm. It approaches to within 3 feet of the camera, and in the infrared footage, its eyes reflect in a way that creates an unsettling effect. The bull remains in front of the camera for nearly 2 minutes, not eating, not moving on, just observing. Then it continues north along the trail. At 3:15 a.m. the same night, the camera captures the most disturbing footage. The bull returns, approaching from the north, moving back down the trail in the direction it had come from. But its gait is completely wrong. It's walking on its hind legs, front legs held against its chest, moving in an upright bipedal stance that looks anatomically impossible. The footage is clear, well lit by infrared, and shows approximately 8 seconds of this bipedal movement before the animal drops back to all fours and moves off camera. On November 5th, at 11:32 p.m., the camera captures footage of the bull approaching the camera from behind, from the tree where the camera is mounted. The angle suggests the animal climbed or was positioned in the tree above the camera, though how it got there is not shown. The footage shows the bull's head and neck in frame, looking down at the camera from above, before it drops to the ground in front of the device and walks away. On November 6th, the final night of footage, something happens that Hassan initially thought was a malfunction. Between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., the camera activates 63 times. Each clip shows the same thing. The bull elk standing directly in front of the camera, perfectly centered in frame, staring into the lens. The clips are spaced at irregular intervals, sometimes 3 minutes apart, sometimes 15, but each shows an identical scene. The animal is not moving, not browsing, not displaying any natural behavior. It's simply standing and watching the camera, as if it understands what the device is and what it does. The final clip, recorded at 4:47 a.m., shows the bull reaching up with one front hoof and precisely striking the camera housing 3 times. The impacts are controlled, deliberate, not the random contact of an animal scratching against a tree. After the 3rd strike, the camera stops recording. When Hassan retrieved the device 2 days later, he found the housing had been opened, the SD card removed and placed on the ground next to the tree, and the camera itself returned to its mounting but facing backward, pointing at the tree trunk instead of the trail. The Department of Fish and Wildlife investigated all 3 reports and examined Hassan's trail camera footage. Their official statement classified the incidents as unusual animal behavior, possibly resulting from habituation to human presence, and noted that elk in areas with high human activity may develop atypical behaviors. They found no evidence of hoaxing or manipulation of the trail camera footage. However, off the record, the investigating officer noted several additional details. All 3 hunters reported the same distinct physical characteristic of the bull: a scar pattern on the right shoulder that resembled a handprint. The trail camera footage shows this same marking clearly. Additionally, 2 other tree stands in the area were found disabled during the same week, with support straps cut cleanly as if with a blade, and climbing steps removed and stacked neatly on the ground beneath the trees. No bull elk matching this description has been harvested in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest since these incidents occurred. The area where the sightings were concentrated is still legal for hunting, and elk populations remain healthy. But local guides report that many experienced hunters now avoid that specific region, and several tree stands that were in place for years have been permanently removed by their owners. The footage remains in the Department of Fish and Wildlife archives, rarely discussed but never explained. And somewhere in the forests of the Dark Divide, among the old-growth hemlocks and Douglas firs, there's an elk that understands cameras, that can open housings and remove SD cards, that can disable tree stands and walk upright when it thinks no one is watching. An elk that has learned to hunt the hunters. Dr. Theodora Aliana had spent 8 years studying atmospheric phenomena in the Pacific Northwest, but nothing in her meteorological training prepared her for what she documented during the autumn of 2023 in the Cascade River valleys. Her research focused on fog formation patterns in mountainous terrain, specifically the unusual persistent fog banks that formed in certain valleys despite weather conditions that should have dispersed them. What began as scientific curiosity evolved into something far more disturbing, and the data she collected challenges our understanding of what fog actually is. Theodora established her primary observation station in a valley northwest of Mount Rainier, an area where local residents had reported fog behavior that defied conventional explanation. The fog would appear suddenly without the temperature and humidity conditions necessary for its formation. It would move uphill against gravity and wind patterns. Most disturbingly, it would form geometric shapes that persisted for hours, maintaining sharp edges and defined boundaries that natural fog should never exhibit. Her initial observations seemed to confirm the anomalies. On September 12th, she recorded fog rising from the valley floor against a steady 15-mile-per-hour wind that should have dispersed it. The fog moved as a coherent mass, maintaining its density and shape as it climbed 300 feet of elevation over the course of 2 hours. Temperature readings showed no inversion layer that would explain the movement. The fog simply ignored the laws of physics that governed its behavior everywhere else. On September 19th, Theodora documented something that made her question whether she was observing natural phenomena at all. The fog formed a perfect hexagonal pattern in the valley. 6 distinct columns of mist rising from equidistant points and meeting at a central location approximately 200 feet above the ground. The formation persisted for 47 minutes before dissipating simultaneously, all 6 columns vanishing within seconds of each other. She checked her equipment repeatedly, convinced there must be a malfunction, but every sensor confirmed what she was seeing. The real breakthrough came on September 24th, when Theodora decided to enter the fog herself. She'd been observing from the safety of her station on the valley rim, but she needed ground-level data to understand what was happening. She equipped herself with a full array of portable sensors, activated her body camera to document the experience, and descended into the valley just as one of the anomalous fog banks began to form. The moment she entered the fog, she knew something was profoundly wrong. Fog is moisture, tiny water droplets suspended in air, and it should feel damp, cold, slightly oppressive. This fog felt different. It had texture, almost like fabric brushing against her skin. It had weight, a subtle pressure that increased the deeper she moved into it. And it had warmth. Not the chill of evaporated moisture, but an organic warmth that made her think of body heat. Her sensors were malfunctioning, or at least she thought they were. The moisture readings showed negative values, which should be impossible. The temperature fluctuated wildly, jumping from 40 degrees to 70, and back within seconds. The air pressure readings made no sense, showing variations that would require altitude changes of thousands of feet. Then she saw the first figure. It appeared about 20 feet ahead of her, a human shape moving through the fog in slow motion. She called out, asking if they needed help, but the figure didn't respond. As she got closer, she realized what she was seeing. The figure was a woman in hiking gear, but she was moving with impossible slowness, each step taking several seconds to complete. Her clothing was from a different era, maybe the 1990s based on the style. And she was transparent, or rather translucent, like she was made of the fog itself. Theodora activated her body camera's thermal imaging mode and saw something that made her blood run cold. The figure registered as heat, but not current heat. The thermal signature was delayed, showing body temperature from minutes ago, as if the image was being played back on a time delay. The woman was walking through the valley, but she was doing so in the past, and somehow the fog was preserving and replaying that movement. Over the next hour, Theodora documented 17 more figures moving through the fog. Some were hiking, some were running, as if fleeing from something. One was a child, no more than 10 years old, sitting on a rock and crying. All of them moved in that same impossible slow motion. All of them were translucent and made of fog, and all of them were from different time periods based on their clothing and equipment. She was looking at decades of preserved moments, frozen in moisture and replayed whenever the fog formed. She tried to interact with the figures, walking directly into their paths, but they passed through her without acknowledgement. They weren't really there, or rather, they were there but separated from her by time, existing in the same space but different moments. The fog was acting like some kind of temporal recording device, capturing and preserving these scenes and playing them back under specific conditions. On October 2nd, Theodora brought additional equipment into the valley, including high-speed cameras and spectral analysis tools. She wanted to understand the mechanism behind what she was seeing. The fog formed right on schedule, appearing from nowhere at 3:47 p.m., just as it had for the previous 12 days. She set up her cameras and waited. What she captured on film that day has been reviewed by 3 separate institutions, and none can explain what it shows. The fog doesn't form gradually like normal fog. It appears instantaneously, materializing in discrete sections that snap into place like pieces of a puzzle. Within those sections, the preserved figures are already moving, already playing out their captured moments. The fog isn't containing these images, it's made of them. Theodora's spectral analysis revealed something even more disturbing. The fog's composition was wrong. Normal fog is water vapor, H2O molecules in gaseous suspension. This fog contained water, but also organic compounds, proteins, and lipids that shouldn't be present in atmospheric moisture. When she sent samples to a lab for analysis, the results suggested the fog contained human tissue at a molecular level, as if people had been broken down and dispersed into vapor. On October 9th, she made a discovery that ended her research immediately and permanently. She was documenting the fog as usual when she saw a figure that looked familiar. It took her a moment to recognize why. The figure was wearing the same jacket she owned, the same distinctive red and black pattern. As the figure turned, Theodora saw her own face. She was looking at herself, preserved in the fog, moving in slow motion through the valley. But she hadn't been in the valley at that moment. She was standing on the rim, observing from above. The preserved version of her was somewhere she hadn't been yet, doing something she hadn't done yet. The fog wasn't just recording the past, it was recording the future. She watched herself, her future self, walk deeper into the valley, watched herself kneel down beside something on the ground, watched herself examine it with growing horror. Then she watched her future self look up, look directly at where she was standing on the rim, and mouth 3 words that she could read even without sound. "Don't come down." Theodora packed up her equipment that day and never returned to the valley. She submitted her preliminary findings to the National Weather Service, carefully editing out the temporal anomalies and focusing on the unusual fog formation patterns. Her recommendations led to the area being designated as hazardous due to unstable atmospheric conditions, and hiking in that specific valley is now strongly discouraged. But she kept copies of everything: the videos showing figures moving through time, the spectral analysis showing human tissue in the fog, the footage of herself warning herself from the future. She kept it all in a secure archive because she needed evidence of what she'd discovered, even if she could never publish it officially. The question that haunts her is simple but terrible. Where do those preserved people go? The fog appears and dissipates on a cycle, forming every day at the same time, playing back its captured moments, then vanishing. But the figures in the fog aren't ghosts or spirits or anything supernatural. They're actual people, broken down to their molecular components and suspended in moisture, experiencing time at a fraction of normal speed. They're still alive in there, still conscious, still experiencing every moment of their preserved existence, but stretched out across decades, a single step taking hours or days or weeks to complete from their perspective. The fog is a trap, and everyone who gets caught in it becomes part of it, becomes another figure moving in slow motion, becomes another moment played back forever in the Cascade valleys. Theodora thinks about that sometimes, late at night when she can't sleep. She thinks about the child she saw crying on the rock, and wonders how long that child has been crying from their perspective, how many subjective years they've experienced, while only minutes have passed in the real world. She thinks about all the missing hikers reported in that area over the past 50 years, and wonders if they're still there, still moving through the fog at impossible speeds. still trying to find their way out. Most of all, she thinks about her future self. The version of her that she saw in the fog, even though it hadn't happened yet. Because if the fog can record the future, that means somewhere in time, she does go back down into that valley. She does ignore her own warning. She does become one of the preserved figures, trapped in moisture and time, living out years or decades or centuries in the space of moments. The fog is still there. It still forms every day at 3:47 p.m. And somewhere in those suspended droplets of water and human tissue, dozens of people are still hiking, still running, still trying to escape from something they can't understand. Time moves differently in the fog banks of the Cascades, and what looks like harmless mist might be a prison that lasts forever. The following account is based on materials recovered from a storage unit in Bellingham, Washington in 2018. The unit had been rented in 1989 under the name Malaya Henderson and remained unpaid for 29 years before being auctioned for back rent. Inside, investigators found a cardboard box containing 127 Polaroid photographs, 5 student identification cards from Western Washington University, 3 journals with handwritten entries, and a cassette tape labeled October 15th, Do Not Listen. The photographs and journals tell the story of 5 college students who went on a fall camping trip in the Mount Hood wilderness and returned with no memory of 11 days. What happened during those missing weeks remains unexplained. But the photographic evidence suggests something that defies rational explanation. The 5 students were Malaya Henderson, Tallulah Morrison, Salem Chen, Dax Rodriguez, and Jace Mitchell, all juniors at Western Washington University in the fall of 1989. According to their journals, they planned a week-long camping trip during fall break, departing on October 6th and intending to return on October 13th. They were experienced campers, had proper equipment, and filed their itinerary with the University Outdoor Recreation Office as required. The trip was meant to be a celebration before midterm exams, a chance to disconnect from academic stress and enjoy the autumn colors in the Cascade wilderness. The first photographs in the sequence show exactly what you'd expect from a college camping trip. 5 friends smiling at the camera, setting up tents, cooking over a camp stove, posing beside a waterfall. The images are dated using the Polaroid camera's date stamp feature. And the first 12 photos span October 6th through 8th. Everyone looks normal, happy, engaged in typical camping activities. Tallulah's journal from this period describes the weather as perfect, the hiking as challenging but rewarding, and the group's spirits as high. There are inside jokes referenced, complaints about Salem's terrible camp cooking, and enthusiastic descriptions of the scenery. Then there's a gap. No photographs, no journal entries, nothing from October 9th. The journals resume on October 10th, but the entries are different. Malaya's handwriting, previously neat and consistent, becomes erratic and shaky. She writes, "We all woke up in different places this morning. I was 50 yards from camp, lying in a stream bed. My clothes were soaked, but I don't remember leaving my tent." Tallulah says she woke up standing against a tree with her arms spread wide. Salem won't talk about where he was. "We're all trying to figure out what happened last night, but nobody can remember anything after dinner." The photographs from October 10th are disturbing. They show the 5 friends, but something is visibly wrong with all of them. Their postures are too rigid, too perfect. They're standing in a line, evenly spaced, all facing the camera with identical expressions. Not smiling, not frowning, just neutral blank faces with eyes that seem to be focusing on something beyond the camera. Dax's journal entry from this day reads, "Found the camera taking pictures by itself this morning. It was set up on a rock, timer light blinking, snapping photos every few minutes. None of us remember setting it up. When we developed the film, We were all in the photos, but we don't remember posing. October 11th shows further deterioration. The photographs capture the group engaging in increasingly bizarre activities. One image shows all 5 of them building a structure in the forest, a tall framework made from branches lashed together with strips of bark. The structure is geometric, precise, almost architectural in its design. Another photo shows them standing in a circle around this structure, heads tilted back, mouths open. Jace's journal mentions this day with growing panic. We keep doing things we don't decide to do. I'll be sitting by the fire, and then suddenly I'm walking through the forest, and I don't remember standing up. We all agree we should leave, should go back to campus. But every time we pack our gear, we end up unpacking it again. Something is keeping us here. The photographs from October 12th through 16th are the most disturbing in the collection. They show physical changes in the students that shouldn't be possible over the course of just a few days. Their eyes reflect wrong in the Polaroid flash, showing bright white eyes shine like animals have, but humans don't. Their skin looks different, paler, with a texture that seems waxy or artificial. In several images, their shadows fall in the wrong direction compared to the light source. Salem appears in one photograph standing beside a tree, but his shadow is cast at a 90-degree angle from everyone else's, as if he's lit by a sun that isn't there. Tallulah's journal from October 14th is barely legible. We're not ourselves anymore. I can feel something else in my head, like there's someone else thinking my thoughts alongside me. When I look at the others, I know they're experiencing the same thing. We still remember who we are, we still have our memories and personalities. But there's something extra now, something that wasn't there before. At night, we build things. I don't know what they are or why we build them. We work in perfect synchronization, never speaking, each of us knowing exactly what the others will do next. The photographs from October 17th show the structure they'd been building. It's massive, easily 20 feet tall, made from hundreds of branches woven together in intricate patterns. In the center of the structure is a chair, and in one photograph, Malaya is sitting in it, with her arms resting on the armrests, her face completely expressionless, staring directly at the camera. The other 4 students are standing around her in a circle, all facing outward, all with their arms raised above their heads in identical positions. The image has a ritualistic quality, like they're performing some kind of ceremony. October 18th marks another gap in the photographic record, but the journals continue. Dax writes, "Something happened last night. We all remember it happening, but we don't remember what it was. We were in the structure, all 5 of us, and there was a sound. Not a sound we heard with our ears, but a sound we felt in our bones, in our teeth. The forest was full of light that wasn't light. And then nothing. This morning the structure is gone. Not torn down, not burned, just gone. The space where it stood is empty. No branches, no debris, not even footprints. The ground is smooth, like nothing was ever there." The final sequence of photographs, dated October 19th, shows the students preparing to leave. But something is wrong with the images themselves. The colors are slightly off, shifted toward purple and green in ways that shouldn't happen with Polaroid film. The students' movements are blurred, but the background is sharp and clear, as if they're moving at different speeds than the rest of the world. In the last photograph, taken with the camera timer, all 5 students are looking directly at the lens, and their expressions are identical, not blank anymore, but knowing, like they share a secret they'll never tell. The journals end on October 20th. Malaya's final entry reads, "We're going back today. We've been gone for 2 weeks, but it feels like months. We don't know how to explain what happened because we don't understand it ourselves. We've decided not to tell anyone about the missing time, about the structure, about the things we built and the places we woke up. We'll say the trip was normal, that we had a great time, that nothing unusual happened. But we'll know. We'll always know that we're different now, that we brought something back with us from the forest, or maybe left something behind. According to university records, all 5 students returned to campus on October 20th, 1989, claiming they'd simply lost track of time and stayed an extra week. They received minor disciplinary action for missing the first 3 days of classes after fall break. Their academic performance remained normal for the rest of the semester. They remained friends, were frequently seen together, and showed no outward signs of trauma or distress. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. The photographs don't stop on October 19th. The box contained 37 additional Polaroids dated between October 22nd and November 15th, 1989. These photos weren't taken in the forest. They were taken on campus, in classrooms, in the student union, in their dorm rooms. And they show the same thing the forest photos showed. The 5 students moving in perfect synchronization, standing in geometric patterns, displaying that same knowing expression. In one image, they're in the university library, each sitting at a different study carrel. But they're all holding their pens at the same angle, all have their heads tilted at the same degree, all have their left hands positioned identically. Another photo shows them in the campus cafeteria, and if you look carefully, you can see that everyone else in the image is slightly blurred, moving at normal speed, while the 5 friends are perfectly sharp and clear, as if they're moving slower or faster than everyone around them. The cassette tape provides the final piece of evidence. The recording is 18 minutes long and consists of the 5 friends speaking in unison, their voices perfectly synchronized, saying words that sound like English but don't form coherent sentences. Linguistic analysis has identified elements of several Native American languages spoken in the Pacific Northwest, mixed with sounds that don't correspond to any known language. The tape ends with all 5 voices counting down from 10 to 1, then silence, then a sound that audio analysts describe as impossible. Multiple frequencies layered in ways that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. All 5 students graduated in 1991 and moved away from Washington. Attempts to locate them for interviews have been unsuccessful. Malaya Henderson's last known address was in Portland, Oregon in 1995. Tallulah Morrison appears in Seattle records through 1998, then vanishes. Salem Chen, Dax Rodriguez, and Jace Mitchell have no documented presence after their graduation. No employment records, no tax returns, no driver's license renewals. It's as if they simply stepped out of documented existence. The photographs remain in the possession of the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office, cataloged as evidence in a cold case file that was never officially opened. The structure they built in the forest was never located, despite several search attempts based on landmarks visible in the photos. The Mount Hood wilderness is vast, and without exact coordinates, finding a specific location is nearly impossible, especially if that location somehow ceased to exist. But the most disturbing detail isn't in the photographs or journals or tape recordings. It's in the student ID cards found in the box. All 5 cards show the same issue date, October 21st, 1989, the day after they returned from the forest. The university has no record of issuing replacement IDs to these students. Their original IDs, the ones they took on the camping trip, were never turned in or reported lost, which means the 5 students who came back from the Mount Hood wilderness on October 20th needed new identification because they weren't the same people who left on October 6th. They looked identical, had the same memories, knew all the right personal details. But something fundamental had changed. Something had replaced them, or merged with them, or transformed them during those missing weeks in October. And whatever they became is still out there somewhere, wearing human faces, moving through the world in perfect synchronization, building structures we can't see and speaking languages we don't understand. The forest gave them back, but it kept something of who they were and added something new. The photographs prove it, the journals document it, and the 5 missing students, wherever they are now, remember everything they refused to tell. This statement was obtained during a private interview conducted in March 2024. The subject, Chris Cairo, worked as a senior counselor for Cascades Youth Renewal Program from 2019 to 2023. The program operated wilderness therapy camps throughout the Cascade Range, working with troubled teens referred by courts, schools, and families. Chris agreed to this interview on condition of anonymity regarding specific camp locations. What he describes represents a systematic institutional knowledge of supernatural phenomena and the deliberate exposure of minors to unexplained danger. I need to start by saying that everyone who works for wilderness therapy programs in the Cascades knows about the sound. It's not written in any manual. It's not part of the official training. But within your first week on the job, a senior counselor will pull you aside and explain the rules. Rule 1. Between 3:45 and 3:50 a.m., you keep the kids in their tents, no matter what. Rule 2. You don't explain why. Rule 3. If a kid asks about the sound the next morning, you tell them they were dreaming. Rule 4. You never, ever go outside during those 5 minutes yourself. The sound happens every single night, at every single camp location we've operated. It doesn't matter if you're in the North Cascades near the Canadian border or down in the Gifford Pinchot near Mount Adams. It doesn't matter if it's summer or winter, clear skies or storms. At exactly 3:47 a.m., the trees start humming. Not individual trees, but all of them together, creating this low-frequency vibration that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. It builds slowly over about 30 seconds, rising in pitch and volume until it peaks around 3:48, then gradually fades away by 3:50. The whole event lasts exactly 5 minutes. The first time you hear it, you think there must be a rational explanation. Wind through the branches, maybe, or some kind of seismic activity. But the sound isn't natural. It's too organized, too musical. There's a rhythm to it, almost like a pulse. And if you listen carefully, you can hear harmonics layering on top of each other, creating chords that shouldn't be possible from wind and wood. Some counselors swear they can hear patterns in it, like the trees are communicating in a language we don't understand. The program has protocols for those 5 minutes. At 3:45, the overnight watch counselor does a quiet circuit of the camp, making sure all tent flaps are zipped and secured. We tell the kids it's for safety, for keeping out animals, but the real reason is containment. We need them inside, behind that thin layer of nylon, when the sound starts. Most kids sleep through it. The ones who wake up usually go back to sleep, convincing themselves it was a dream. But some kids, the sensitive ones, or the naturally curious ones, they become fixated on it. I worked at the program for 4 years, did probably 200 overnight rotations, heard the sound hundreds of times. You never get used to it. Every night at 3:46, I'd be lying in my tent counting down the seconds, knowing what was coming. The sound would start, and I'd feel it in my bones, this deep thrumming that made my teeth ache and my stomach clench. I'd lie there perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting for it to end. And I'd pray that all the kids stayed in their tents, because the ones who didn't, well, that's why I'm giving this statement. The incident I need to tell you about happened in August 2022. We had a group of 8 teens, ages 14 to 17, doing a 3-week intensive program. Standard troubled youth stuff, minor drug offenses, truancy, behavioral issues at home. Nothing violent, nothing that suggested we were dealing with kids who couldn't follow basic rules. The counselor team was me, Marjorie Soleil, and 2 junior counselors, Cynthia and Sean. Marjorie had been with the program longer than anyone, almost 12 years, and she knew the protocols better than the manual itself. One of the kids in our group was named Milo, a 16-year-old from Seattle who had been referred after multiple suspensions for skipping class. Smart kid, maybe too smart for his own good. He had this analytical mind that wouldn't let things go unexplained. By the end of the first week, I could tell he'd heard the sound and was trying to make sense of it. He'd ask careful questions during the day, probing around the edges. Do you guys ever hear weird noises at night? Are there a lot of animals in this area? What kind of trees make that humming sound when the wind blows? Marjorie and I would deflect, redirect, follow the protocol. We'd tell him he was probably hearing the wind, or maybe his ears were adjusting to the silence of the wilderness after living in the city. But Milo wasn't buying it. I could see him watching us at night, see him lying in his tent with his eyes open when he thought we weren't looking. He was planning something. On the 14th night of the program, August 23rd, Milo made his move. I was on overnight watch, doing my 3:45 tent check, when I noticed his tent flap was unzipped. Not much, maybe 6 inches, just enough for him to see out. I walked over to secure it, and that's when I realized the tent was empty. Milo was gone. I immediately woke Marjorie, and we did a quick perimeter search, but we couldn't find him. It was 3:46, 1 minute before the sound would start, and we had a decision to make. Protocol said we should be in our tents, but we also had a missing kid who was about to be outside when whatever happens at 3:47 happens. Marjorie made the call. She would stay with the other kids, make sure they stayed secured. I would find Milo and get him back before the sound peaked. I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the forest, moving as fast as I dared in the darkness. I was calling Milo's name in a harsh whisper, trying to be loud enough for him to hear, but quiet enough not to wake the other teens. At 3:47 exactly, sound started. The trees around me began to hum, and I felt that familiar pressure in my chest, that resonance that made my bones vibrate. But I was committed now. I had to find him. I spotted Milo about 50 yards from camp, standing in a small clearing with his phone held up, recording video. He was just standing there, perfectly still, with this expression of absolute focus on his face. I ran to him, grabbed his arm, and tried to pull him back toward camp. He didn't resist, but he didn't help either. He was completely fixated on something in the trees above us. I looked up, and that's when I saw them. The trees were moving, bending inward toward the clearing, their branches reaching down like arms. And in the spaces between the branches, in the shadows cast by my flashlight, there were shapes, figures. They were climbing down from the canopy, using the branches like ladders, moving with this fluid grace that nothing human should have. They looked almost human from a distance, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But as they got closer, I could see they were wrong. Too tall, too thin, joints bending in directions that violated anatomy. The sound was overwhelming now, at its peak intensity, and I realized it wasn't coming from the trees themselves. It was coming from these things, these creatures climbing down. They were making the sound, using it to coordinate their movement, maybe using it to communicate. There were dozens of them, surrounding us, moving closer with each pulse of that rhythmic hum. I yanked Milo hard, snapping him out of his trance, and we ran. We crashed through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, the sound following us, getting louder instead of softer. I could hear movement in the trees above us, hear branches creaking as those things pursued us through the canopy. At 3:49, we burst back into camp and dove into my tent, zipping it closed just as the sound began to fade. Marjorie was there, standing outside her tent with a flashlight, and the look on her face told me she knew what had happened. She'd broken protocol. She'd let me go out during the sound, and we both knew it was a mistake. But Milo was back. He was safe, and in another 60 seconds, the sound would be completely gone. Except this time, it didn't end at 3:50. The sound continued, softer but persistent, and through the tent fabric, I could see shadows moving around the camp. I could hear footsteps, lots of them circling our tents. I could hear breathing that wasn't human, raspy and wet. The other kids were waking up, calling out in fear, asking what was happening. Marjorie was trying to keep them calm, telling them to stay in their tents. But I could hear the panic in her voice. The sound finally stopped at 3:52, 2 minutes late, and the shadows dispersed. When we emerged at first light, we found marks everywhere. Long scratches in the bark of surrounding trees, as if something with claws had climbed down them. Depressions in the ground around each tent. Perfectly spaced footprints that were too narrow and too long to be human. And in the center of camp, arranged in a circle, were 7 stones that hadn't been there the night before. We packed up that day and ended the program session 2 weeks early. The official report stated unexpected severe weather conditions as the reason. Milo's phone, the one he'd used to record video, was found in his tent with the battery completely dead and the memory corrupted. Nothing could be recovered. The program continued operating after that, but new protocols were added. Camps were no longer established in certain areas, the ones where the sound seemed strongest. Kids with histories of defiance or rule-breaking were screened more carefully. And counselors were explicitly told during training, if a kid goes outside during the sound, you don't go after them. You wait until 3:50 and then you search. Because whatever comes down from the trees when they're humming, it's dangerous. And it gets more dangerous if you interrupt it. I quit 3 months after the incident with Milo. I couldn't do it anymore, couldn't knowingly take kids into those forests, couldn't lie to parents about what we were exposing their children to. The program is still operating today, still running camps throughout the Cascades, still hearing that sound every single night at 3:47 a.m. And the counselors still follow the protocols, still keep the kids in their tents, still pretend that nothing unusual is happening. But something is climbing down from those trees every night, and one day someone's going to be outside when it reaches the ground. And when that happens, we're going to find out what the sound really means, what those things actually want. I just hope I'm far away when it does. My name is Soleil Zaria, and until 3 months ago, I worked as a forest inventory specialist for the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. My job was to locate, document, and tag old-growth trees in the Cascade Wilderness for conservation purposes. It's meticulous work, requiring attention to detail and the ability to spend long periods alone in remote forests. I loved it. Past tense. Because I can't go back into those woods now, and I can't look at trees without seeing what I know is hidden in the bark. The assignment that changed everything started in July 2024. I was tasked with surveying a 20-square-mile section of the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, an area that hadn't been properly inventoried since the 1970s. The terrain was difficult, the trees were magnificent, and I expected the work would take me about 6 weeks to complete. I had all my equipment, my GPS coordinates, my marking tags, and my camera. Standard procedure was to photograph each significant tree from multiple angles, measure its diameter and estimated height, assess its health, and attach a numbered aluminum tag to its trunk for future reference. The first 3 weeks were routine. I cataloged Douglas firs, western red cedars, and hemlocks, some of them easily 500 years old. I documented their locations, took my photographs, and moved systematically through the grid pattern I'd established. The forest was quiet, peaceful, exactly the kind of environment I'd always found meditative. I'd camp in a different location every few nights, covering ground efficiently, making good progress toward completing the survey. On July 22nd, I was working in a particularly dense section of old growth when I noticed something unusual about a western red cedar I was documenting. The bark had a pattern in it, a configuration of ridges and furrows that looked remarkably like a human face. Not vaguely face-like the way clouds sometimes look like faces, but distinctly, unmistakably human. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, all formed by the natural texture of the bark. I took several close-up photographs, fascinated by the pareidolia, the tendency of the human brain to see faces in random patterns. As I continued working that day, I noticed more faces. They were everywhere once I started looking for them, hidden in the bark textures of trees throughout the area. Some were subtle, requiring the right angle and lighting to see clearly. Others were so pronounced they seemed almost carved. I documented each one, thinking it would make an interesting addition to my report, maybe even warrant a footnote about the psychological phenomenon of pattern recognition in natural environments. That evening, reviewing my photographs on my laptop, I noticed something that made me pause. One of the faces I'd photographed looked familiar. Not just human, but specifically familiar, like I'd seen that particular face before. I zoomed in on the image, enhancing the contrast to bring out the details, and felt a chill run through me. The face in the bark looked exactly like the photograph on a missing person poster I'd seen at the ranger station. A hiker named Camden who disappeared in this general area in 2019. I told myself I was seeing things, making connections that weren't there. Missing person posters show thousands of people every year, and the human brain is excellent at finding patterns where none exist. But I pulled up the digital copy of the poster on my phone and compared it to my photograph. The resemblance was striking. Same facial structure, same expression, even the same slight tilt of the head. The next day, I went back to that tree and examined it more carefully. In daylight, without the camera's flash, the face was still there, still unmistakably present in the bark texture. I measured the tree's diameter, estimated its age based on growth patterns. The tree was approximately 70 years old, which meant the bark pattern had been forming for decades. But Camden had only disappeared 5 years ago. The face couldn't be him. It was just a coincidence, just my brain making connections that weren't real. Except I kept finding more faces, and more of them looked familiar. A woman named Braylin, who'd gone missing in 2015. A teenager named Cielo, who'd disappeared in 2007. A man named Eliseo, whose case dated back to 1998. I started cross-referencing my tree photographs with missing person databases, and the matches kept accumulating. Not all the faces corresponded to missing people, but enough of them did to establish a pattern that couldn't be explained by coincidence. I began documenting the correlation systematically. I'd photograph a face in the bark, note the tree's location and estimated age. Then search missing person records for matches. Over the next week, I identified 43 faces that closely resembled people who had disappeared in the Cascade wilderness over the past 50 years. All of them had gone missing in this general region. All of them had vanished without a trace, leaving behind no evidence, no clues, no explanation. The implications were impossible, but undeniable. Somehow, the trees were preserving these people, not their bodies. Search teams would have found physical remains if they were buried nearby. But their faces, their identities, captured in the growing bark like photographs in wood. The trees were incorporating them, making them permanent features of the forest. On August 3rd, I made a discovery that transformed my scientific curiosity into genuine fear. I was working in a grove of particularly ancient Douglas firs when I found a face that stopped me cold. It was forming in the bark of a tree I'd tagged just 2 days earlier, a tree I'd photographed extensively, a tree whose bark had shown no unusual patterns when I'd first documented it. But now, there was a face, and it was my face. Not similar to my face, not reminiscent of my features, but exactly, precisely my face. The same scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood fall. The same asymmetry in my smile. The same small mole on my right cheek. I was looking at myself preserved in bark that had somehow changed in just 48 hours. I touched the bark, running my fingers over the ridges that formed my eyes, my nose, my mouth. The texture was warm, warmer than wood should be in the cool forest air. And as I touched it, I felt something. A connection. A sense of being recognized, of being claimed. The tree knew me. The forest knew me. And it was marking me as its own. I left the grove immediately, packed my equipment, and hiked back to the nearest Forest Service road where I'd left my vehicle. I told myself I was overreacting, that I needed to get out of the woods for a few days, clear my head, approach this situation rationally. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew my face had appeared on that tree impossibly fast. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I stayed in those woods much longer, I wouldn't leave at all. I filed my preliminary report with the DNR, carefully editing out any mention of faces or missing persons. I claimed equipment malfunction had corrupted my data and requested reassignment to a different survey area. My supervisor approved without question. I'm good at my job, reliable, not prone to making excuses. If I said I needed to move to a different location, there was no reason to doubt me. But I couldn't stop thinking about those faces. About the connection between the trees and the missing people. About my own face forming in bark that had been smooth just days before. I started researching, looking for any documentation of similar phenomena. I found scattered references in folklore. Stories about forests that claim travelers, trees that trap souls, woods that never release those who enter. But nothing scientific. Nothing that would help me understand what was happening. 2 weeks after I left that survey area, I noticed something disturbing. My skin was changing. Just slightly, just enough to notice when I looked closely in the mirror. The texture was becoming rougher, more lined, developing patterns that resembled bark. I went to a dermatologist who diagnosed it as eczema and prescribed a cream. But the cream didn't help. The bark-like texture continued spreading, starting on my hands and forearms, slowly advancing. I tried to go back. I thought maybe if I returned to the forest, to that tree with my face in its bark, I could understand what was happening, maybe reverse it. But when I reached the turnoff to the Forest Service road, my truck wouldn't start. When I tried to hike in, I got lost despite having GPS coordinates. Every attempt to return to that area failed for different reasons, as if the forest was telling me it wasn't ready for me yet. The transformation is accelerating now. The bark texture has spread to my shoulders, my back, my chest. Sometimes I can feel my heartbeat slowing, becoming more like the patient pulse of sap rising through wood, then blood pumping through veins. Sometimes I stand perfectly still for hours without realizing time has passed, rooted to whatever spot I'm standing in, not needing to move. I know what's happening. I know where this ends. One morning, I'll wake up and won't be able to move at all. My skin will have completed its transformation to bark. My fingers will have stretched into branches. My feet will have burrowed into whatever ground I'm standing on. And eventually, I'll make my way back to those woods. Not by choice, but by inevitability, drawn by whatever force calls all the missing people to become part of the forest. The faces in the bark aren't warnings. They're invitations. They're the forest's way of claiming what it wants, marking those who spend too long in its presence, those who look too carefully at its secrets. Every person who's disappeared in those mountains is still there, still conscious in some way I can't fully comprehend, still part of the trees that grow in the darkness. I'm writing this as documentation, as evidence of what I've discovered. By the time anyone reads it, I'll probably be gone. Another missing person. Another unsolved disappearance. But if you're planning to visit the old-growth forests of the Cascades, if you're going to spend time alone among trees that have stood for centuries, do yourself a favor. Don't look too closely at the bark. Don't try to find patterns in the ridges and furrows. And if you happen to see a face that looks familiar, don't touch it. Don't acknowledge it. Just walk away. Because the forest is always watching, always choosing, always ready to add another face to its collection. If you found these stories disturbing, if they made you question what's really happening in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, then subscribe to Verified Fears for more tales that blur the line between truth and terror. Hit that like button, drop a comment about which story unsettled you the most, and turn on notifications so you never miss when we venture into the dark corners where reality breaks down. The Cascades are hiding more secrets than we covered tonight, and Verified Fears will be there to document every one of them. Until next time, stay out of the deep woods. And remember, not everything that goes missing stays gone.